So I invite you now to pay attention to the screens as we read our scripture text from this morning, which comes to us from Luke 24, verses 1 through 12. It says this: On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, that's the 7 a.m. service, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. Remember how he told you that while he was still with you in Galilee? The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." And then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. And bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves. And he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. Wondering to himself what had happened. If you can, take a look at the screen and you'll see an image. Does anyone know what this is? Does anyone know what that is? It's not the Eye of Sauron or anything like that. That is what we might be able to see in about 8 days. On April 8th, we're having a solar eclipse here in Ohio. And I've never seen a solar eclipse, especially a full one before. And I'm super excited. Has anyone bought glasses yet and is prepared to do it? All right, I've got it cleared off on my calendar. And I was so excited until I learned that in Ohio in April, there's only a 30% chance of it not being cloudy. If there's a solar eclipse and it's cloudy outside, I will not be a happy kid. But I do know this. When I see it, what's special about it is I'm going to look up at the sky and I'm going to see the moon cover the sun. And what's going to happen, I just know, is my mouth is going to go, whoa, amazing. This is incredible, right? There's that really sacred moment when you experience something beautiful where you have wonder and awe. You probably didn't catch it, but twice in the text that we read this morning was the word wonder. In Greek, it's thaumazo, where the women get to the tomb and they were like, what's going on? And their minds started to have that solar eclipse experience where their jaw drops and they go to themselves, what could it be? Is it possible? And when Peter runs to the tomb and he gets there, his jaw drops and his eyes open and he has that solar eclipse experience just like the women where he goes, oh, is it possible? Today we're going to talk for just a minute about wonder and about awe and the possibilities that Jesus' resurrection bring to our world. But before we get to awe, before we get to wonder, you have to understand something about this story, which is that Jesus actually died. You know, for us that live on this side of the resurrection and only know Jesus now, if you were one of Jesus' followers on that day, and it was, just a normal day, they went to his tomb, up until that point, the death rate was hovering around 100%. Every single person who died stayed dead. And when Jesus died, you have to understand that his disciples really thought that it was over, and everyone else thought that it was over too. It wasn't like he died, and then they were like setting a timer for when he was coming back. When he died, and they were ready to just move on. The way that this story starts wasn't with an optimistic note. I don't know if you remember, but the very first words are, very early in the morning, the women were going to the tomb with spices. Now, why would you take spices? It's to embalm a body that's already gone. Jesus died really quickly on the cross, and when they took the body down, they had just barely enough time to wrap it in linens and get it into where it needed to go because of the Sabbath that was coming. And so Jesus, when he died, wasn't able to receive the proper rites and processes that you normally would have when someone dies in Jewish culture. And so on this particular day, it was right after the Sabbath was over, the women were coming feeling really almost guilty and bad that Jesus didn't get what he deserved, which was someone to come and put those really nice things around him. And so they showed up fully expecting to find a dead body. They weren't ready for a resurrection. And when they get there, they wouldn't have brought, by the way, they wouldn't have brought the spices if they thought that he was alive. And so the women who were there didn't expect it to happen. And of course, once they get there and they find the stone rolled away, their next thought isn't, oh, he's alive. Do you know what their next thought was? Someone took him. Someone took him. So you have to understand, every baby step where they start to discover that Jesus might be alive, they respond with cynicism and doubt, because that's the way we're trained and that's the way the world's made us. And so they see a rolled away tomb and their first thought isn't, where is he? Instead, they look down and they look around and they think to themselves, someone took him. And even the guards that were there get frustrated. No one thinks that he's alive at this point. And they walk in and they find the clothes that are still there. And even then, they don't really get it. You see, if you're a grave robber and you're stealing a body, you don't take off the linens and leave them nicely folded, do you? No. And they get in and they see the nicely folded bright white clothes there, and there's no body. And then their next thought isn't, where's Jesus? Their next thought is, well, who took him and did this? So the doubt is real and deep. Eventually, an angel shows up and tells them, how did you guys miss it? And they're like, what did we miss? And they said, don't you remember that he told you this was going to happen? And it's like every single conversation with my wife where she's like, don't you remember? And I'm like, no, I don't. And then I remember. And so what happens is eventually they remember, and they're like, whoa, all right, so he said this, I remember, could it possibly be? And the way that the text describes their response is wonder. They don't yet believe. They don't really know what's happening. They're still deeply confused. But just like that solar eclipse moment, they start to go, oh, could it be? Is it possible? And so what do they do next? I don't know how far they had to go exactly, but it says they ran all the way to the 11. Why was there 11 instead of 12? Remember Judas. That didn't work out well. So now they're down to 11, and they haven't replaced him yet. That happens in a few chapters later in Acts. But they get to the 11, and you would think that the apostles, the disciples of Jesus, would be ready for this good news to happen. Most people forget about this unique fact. When Jesus died on the cross, of the 12 disciples that had been with him his whole life, only one of them was there when he died. Only one. One had killed himself, and the other 10 went hiding. So when Jesus is hanging on the cross in his moment of greatest need, the people that had been with him and seen him the most and knew him the most powerfully and deeply abandoned him, thinking that once you get the death sentence of a cross, that's real death and that's the end. And so they left. And so they show up, these women, to the disciples, and they bring this news. They say, you guys, you're never going to believe this. I mean, how would you even deliver this news? By the way, one of the things that makes Liberty unique is we actually allow women to be leaders in our church. Part of it is because of this. Do you know who the apostles to the apostles were? It was these women. And these women were the first ones to see the empty tomb, and they ran to the disciples. And they show up to the disciples and they say, hey, did you know? He wasn't there. And we met angels. And they say that he's risen. And how do the disciples respond? Do you remember? The text says that they thought they were speaking nonsense. Did they believe? Nope. Because they knew that once someone dies, they're just dead. That's how it works. It's always been that way, and it's never changed. And so even after you have an empty tomb, women who were there to visit, plus you have an angel experience, and they run back to tell the disciples, the way that they respond is with doubt and cynicism. It's like you're looking up at a solar eclipse, and you just go, well, that's science. And you just kind of walk away. And instead, the women were like, no, you have to come see. Well, the way that text works is only one disciple in this story gets up, and his name was Peter. And he runs to the tomb too. And we think that it was Peter because he knew Jesus the closest of all the disciples. And if anyone knew that Jesus was capable of doing something incredible, it was Peter. And so he runs there. And he finds the empty tomb and he sees the empty clothes. And the text says that his response wasn't doubt and wasn't anger and wasn't cynicism, but just wonder. In Greek, it's thaumazo, that experience of going, You know, it's easy for us 2,000 years later, when you come to an Easter service, to just go, yay, this is the day we celebrate Jesus rising from the dead. But if you were there at the time, it would have come as a deeper and more powerful shock than you could ever imagine, because everyone that had ever died up until that point stayed dead. And they found an empty tomb, and you should know that this is how it went down after the days that this happened. Is they started passing around rumors and stories that Jesus had risen from the dead, and everyone else's thoughts were what? Yeah, right. Yeah, right. There's all these stories about how, well, maybe someone took the body, or maybe someone hid the body, or maybe they burned the body. And in fact, the Jewish leaders, Roman leaders, had actually gathered together to spread those rumors because they didn't want anyone to know that they couldn't find his body and that he might be alive. One of the things that is very important to know about this story is that after Jesus rose from the dead, he actually appeared to many people over many different places and to many different people. It wouldn't have been enough. You have to understand, to overcome the doubt and cynicism that we have about the possibility of the resurrection took a lot. Took a lot. What would it take for you to believe that it's possible that someone could really rise from the dead? What would it take for you to believe? What proof would you need to believe that someone that you loved rose from the dead? I'm not going to lie, it would take a lot for me. It would take a lot. Let me tell you a story. I have this friend where his dad and him had signed up at Christmas time for one of those like Christmas things where there's families that are in need. And they give their list of toys that they would like, and it's an adopt a family program. So they signed up and they found out how many kids the family had and what their gifts were. And they went out, and this dad and this son, actually good friends of mine, they went out and they bought everything on the list and they wrapped them up very nicely. And it was a couple days before Christmas. And they went to this family's house with this huge bag of gifts. And they were so excited to give all these presents to this family that they knew had signed up because they needed help and couldn't afford it. So they show up and they've got all these gifts, and the dad and the son ring the doorbell, and someone opens the door. And when they open the door, they're greeted by the dad. And as they say, oh, thank you, this is incredible, and hand them the presents, the dad just peers around the corner and sees that there's already tons and tons of presents under the tree. And they shut the door and they walk away. And of course, what's the dad thinking? The dad's thinking to himself, this is such a scam. I can't believe they got me. What a joke. I can't believe I got hustled for this. And as they're walking away, before he has a chance to say what's on his mind, the little boy, who is only, 7 years old at the time, looks up at his dad and says, Dad, isn't that amazing? Other people brought them presents too. One person can look at something with doubt and cynicism and see all the worst things that they could ever imagine. And it takes the innocence of a child to look at the same situation and see the possibility for what could have happened that's good and wonderful. How you view something changes everything about it. When one person looks at an empty tomb, they can see a scam. And when another person looks at an empty tomb, they can see a miracle. And the difference between what actually happens not only comes down to reality, which is sometimes hard to discern, but it comes down to the faith and the cynicism that divides every single one of our hearts and who we are and what we believe. And I want you to know that that's normal and that's okay, and I have that too. I remember when I wasn't a Christian, and I was a very big skeptic of the faith. And I was wondering, hey, I had friends that were Christians, and every time I would hang out with them, I almost felt like I had to make fun of them. I'm like, so hold on, you guys actually believe that someone rose from the dead? Like, you really believe that? And they'd be like, yeah, we do. And I'm like, you're nuts. You're absolutely crazy. And that was kind of like my mentality and my spirit for growing up. And I'll never forget when my mind started to change on it. I was an 18-year-old kid. And I had heard all these books about why Jesus might rise from the dead or not. And I'll tell you what, if you want to convince someone that Jesus rose from the dead and you try to give them a bunch of arguments for why, how effective do you think that's going to be? There's usually something deeper underneath it all, and there was for me. Underneath it all was I didn't want to believe. I had no desire to believe. I actually thought that Christianity and Jesus and all that whole stuff in church meant that you were weak and that you had problems with your life that you needed someone else to solve. So I approached life with like an intense cynicism. And I know I'm not alone in that. What changed in my life was a day where I experienced a radical vision of the kind of love that God might have for me. Where someone told me, and I didn't believe it at the time, that no matter what I'd ever done, and no matter what was in my heart, that the God of the universe loved me unconditionally and showed me infinite grace, forgives me of all my sins, and because of that, I'm always welcome home in His arms. And when someone told me that, I thought to myself, oh, whatever, I don't really know what's that. But the turning point in my life was when I recognized that who I want to be more than anything in the world is someone who experiences love. More than being successful, more than being rich, more than being popular, more than being fit, more than being anything, I wanted to know what love was. And I wanted to live in that kind of love and have that kind of relationship in my life. And so when someone told me the good news about Jesus, I said, all right, let me think about it. And I went down on a dock, and this was up in Malibu, Canada, north of Vancouver. I can still remember the day and where I was. I was dangling my feet in the ocean, and I'm looking up at these huge mountains. It's always easier to believe in Jesus when it's beautiful outside. And I was dangling my feet in the ocean, and I remember thinking to myself very clearly, God, I do not know how all this works. I don't know very much about the Bible at all. I'd never really even read it. And I don't really understand how someone could be raised from the dead. But I'm kind of in awe of this idea that you love me, and I'd like to give it a shot. And I remember Peter was standing there in the tomb, and you can imagine he probably sat there by himself for a couple minutes. And he's sitting there thinking to himself with his mind open in a way that had never been open before. And he thinks to himself, God, could this be real? Is it possible? I remember the day that it happened for me, where I didn't understand how everything worked, and I didn't know how it was all going to go. But I decided that day to say, Jesus, I don't know how, but I know who. And I'm starting to get to know you and your love, and I want to know that more than anything I've ever wanted to know in my whole life. Because I've never experienced a love like yours, and a love like yours is all that I could ever possibly want. And so if any of you know my story, I came to faith, and then I spent the next 14 years in school. I actually ended up with a doctorate in theology because I wanted to understand it all. And I'll tell you this, no one understands it all. At 7 a.m., we did a worship service out there in the pathway to the sun. And as we were standing out there, we were standing where the ashes are of many people that have died and that have come before us, that actually paved the way for many of us to be here. One of the things I always remind people of is everyone that's ever died before didn't die with all their questions answered and then they believed. Belief is just a sense of saying, God, rather than have all this cynicism and doubt in my life that grinds me down and destroys all my hope, instead what I'm going to do is for just a little tiny moment, I'm going to open up my heart and wonder, is it possible? And could you really love me this much? What you find when you open up your heart even just a little bit. Jesus says that if you have the faith of a mustard seed, and mustard seeds, I'll be honest, I'm not a farmer, but I've heard they're really small. He says if you have a faith that's just really tiny, that's enough. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to know everything. All you have to do is want to look up at that eclipse, look up at that empty tomb, and say, could it be possible? And here's what we find, is that if you take one step toward God, just a baby step, what we find is that He takes 1,000 steps toward you. In the parable of the prodigal son, there's a kid that had offended his parents, that had done everything wrong, taken all of his inheritance and run off and was hanging out. And when he comes home, what we find is not a God who judges us, not a God who, when we finally come home, sits us down and says, well, if you're going to live under my house, there's going to be some rules. When one of my kids does something wrong, I turn into mean dad. That is not the God that we meet in the Bible. The God we meet in the Bible is one where after we've done everything wrong we could possibly do, if we start dragging ourselves home and we take a few steps toward God, the way the story works is that the God of the universe picks up his clothes and runs in his little sandals and his Birkenstocks all the way out to where he can see us. And he grabs us and he hugs us and he says, kid, welcome home. I love you so much. I've missed you. He emptied the tomb and came out of the grave, not because he wanted to show off. It's so that he could rescue the kids that he loves. You are beloved by the God of the universe. There is nothing you could ever do. Everything you've ever done to God is swept away, and instead he replaces it with an unconditional love and forgiveness where he says, hey kid, just come hang out with me. I love you. I rose from the dead not to judge. I rose from the dead to welcome you home. Friends, the good news of the gospel is that if you even just believe this much, what you do is you open your hands and you say, God, I don't know how this works, but if there was an empty tomb, I want to be a part of it. If there's a living hope that's out there, I don't want to be the one that's judging and cynical and dark, but instead I open my mind and my heart to what you can do in it. And so this Easter Sunday, my prayer for you and for me is that God would open our hearts and our minds to receive the good news that his love is unconditional for us and that we are welcome home. Will you bow your heads and pray with me? God, on this beautiful, beautiful Easter morning, we open our hands and look up at a sky, and our hearts are open with the possibility of resurrection. Would you free us from the doubts that we have? Would you give us the kind of hope that we need to believe that we could be forgiven? And would you set us on a fresh path of awe and wonder at the love that comes to us in Jesus? And we pray all of these things in your name, and all God's people said, amen.